Yeah, I second that. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. And Britt and Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. I think most of us know who Britt and Matt are, but let's see. Britt is at NCAR in the Earth Observing Lab, the Science and Instrumentation Group. Britt got his bachelor's in Earth Atmospheric and Planetary Science from Harvard, and then a PhD from Scripps in Oceanography. Britt's interested in the global carbon cycle across the different realms of the Earth system, and his research focuses on developing and deploying new instruments for a wide range of platforms. And they're going to be talking about ORCAS today, which stands for the O2N2 ratio and CO2 airborne Southern Ocean study, great acronym, which was an NSF-sponsored airborne field campaign out of South America in early 2016. So, Britt, thanks again for being here, and please go right ahead.
Great, thanks for having me. As was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the ORCAS campaign, which was an ambitious effort to make high-resolution observations of biogeochemically relevant species over the Southern Ocean using the NSF NCAR Gulfstream 5 aircraft, the wing of which is shown here, spiraling down over, I think, Marguerite Bay. For those who have not met me or have not met, I have a picture here that was obviously taken before the field campaign when I was naive and had not gotten a bunch of gray hairs yet. I'll tell you all about the efforts that went into this. My co-PI is Matt Long, who's ocean biogeochemical modeler. So ORCAS was notable for having heavy modeling influence in an observational campaign from the start. And we took the G5 down to Punta Arenas, Chile last January and February for a period of about 6 weeks. And next slide, in addition to Matt, there was a team of about 8 PIs. Ralph Keeling from Scripps was involved in the oxygen measurements. Eric Court from University of Michigan supported CO2 measurements as well as atmospheric particle dispersion modeling. Colm Sweeney from NOAA was supporting an additional CO2 instrument as well as doing measurements in the water on the Gould. Elliot Atlas from the University of Miami had a companion proposal funded to conduct reactive gas measurements, and Michelle Gierach from JPL was supporting a hyperspectral remote sensing instrument. So each of these people sort of had whole teams associated with the various campaign components. I won't have time to name everyone here, but we had a team supporting the carbon cycle measurements, the reactive gas measurements, the remote sensing measurements. We also had a full complement of aerosol and cloud microphysics instruments on the plane to take advantage of this opportunity, being somewhere where there aren't a lot of those measurements. We had a forecasting team and as well as a team doing atmospheric and biogeochemical / climate modeling. We leveraged the campaign to do a lot of education and outreach activities, and we tried to collaborate with as many external folks as possible. So the primary funding for ORCAS came from NSF Polar Programs and the Lower Atmosphere Observing Facility. I'll say a few words about that in a minute. And then there were additional proposals funded by NSF Atmospheric Chemistry and NASA Ocean Biology and Biogeochemistry. The general big picture motivation for ORCAS is probably quite familiar to this audience, but I'll say it again. The Southern Ocean is a significant sink for anthropogenic CO2. It's estimated that of the anthropogenic CO2 taken up by the global ocean, about 40% of it has entered south of 40 South. And we know that this sink is likely to be sensitive to climate change. The current state of modeling of air-sea CO2 fluxes in the Southern Ocean is one of large disagreements between models. And of course, if we want to have confidence in projections of climate carbon feedbacks, we'd like to improve our understanding of what's going on now, and in particular the seasonal cycle provides a good laboratory for testing these models. Atmospheric oxygen is a somewhat new measurement in this context, but if you measure oxygen and CO2 at the same time, you can learn a lot about what's affecting the CO2 fluxes because they have distinct relationships with the thermal, biological, and anthropogenic drivers. In considering what types of measurements to use to improve our understanding of the Southern Ocean, it's clear that we need both long-term observations over large areas and also intensive campaigns such as this in order to capture the high frequency and high spatial resolution variations and put the longer term measurements in context. Campaigns like this, of course, also leverage the long term measurements to put them in temporal context. By measuring in the atmosphere rather than the ocean, we get an integrated view of air-sea fluxes. The atmosphere over short time scales integrates over much larger areas. But if you're just measuring at surface sites, say for example by collecting flasks at Palmer Station, you're limited by uncertainties in atmospheric transport. So the aircraft has a number of advantages. It can measure signals over a large range of spatial scales, and by measuring gases over the full tropospheric column, we can overcome a lot of the uncertainties in relating atmospheric concentrations to surface fluxes that come in from transport models. And finally, oxygen in the atmosphere is very difficult to measure just because there's so much of it. The changes are out at the 10 to the minus 6 relative level. But there are now techniques that allow this to be done from aircraft. The changes in oxygen are so small that changes in other gases contribute diluting effects, so we can't really talk about the mole fraction of oxygen or say ppm of oxygen, and instead oxygen measurements are reported in terms of the relative deviations in the oxygen to nitrogen ratio. So that's where the O2N2 in the ORCAS acronym comes from, and the definition of per meg is shown here, and that'll show up on some plots later. So the big picture motivation is encapsulated by the top left plot on this slide, which comes from the CMIP-5 collection of Earth system models as presented by Anav et al. And it shows the model predictions of air-sea CO2 fluxes for the Southern Ocean, and as you can see, it's just complete spaghetti. The models disagree on magnitude and also in phase of the seasonal cycle. On the right is a smaller collection of ocean biogeochemistry model predictions of oxygen fluxes, and the agreement is quite a bit better. At least the models all think that oxygen is coming out in the summer and going in the winter. And the reason why it's such a mess for CO2 and not quite as bad for oxygen can be understood by looking at the drivers of these fluxes. Now in the lower two panels, I've broken down observational estimates of CO2 and oxygen fluxes into essentially biological and thermal components. For CO2, you can use sea surface temperature to estimate what the thermal contribution is, and then by subtraction get the non-thermal, which is mostly biological. And similarly for oxygen, you can use estimates of heat fluxes to get at the thermal component, and by subtraction estimate the biological component. So the blue line here for CO2 is the Takahashi estimate that comes from partial pressure measurements of CO2 in surface waters, and the red is indicating seasonal cycle with outgassing during summer when the waters are warming and ingassing during winter when they're cooling, whereas the green, which represents essentially biology, is doing the opposite, outgassing during winter when you're mixing deep waters high in CO2 to the surface, and ingassing during winter when you have net productivity. So for CO2, these two oppose, and if you have a small error in your model in one of these components, you can have a really big error in the balance between them. For oxygen, the thermal and biological components are in phase, so a small error in your model of one component or another leads to a relatively small error in the total. So just staring at this top left panel, and particularly in summer, say in January and February, got Matt and me thinking way back in 2013 about how we could go and do some measurements to try and improve this situation. And so we set about doing that. The way you get Gulfstream 5 to go fly around the Southern Ocean is by requesting it from NSF. NSF supports the lower atmospheric observing facilities, which is a huge collection of surface and airborne instruments, including things like radars and networks of towers. On the far left here, you see the G5. And for small requests of these, the process is fairly quick and streamlined. You can submit a request and be out flying within a year. But for large campaigns, which ORCAS qualified as because it was international and involved a lot of other collaborators, the process is quite long in time. You have to get your proposals in several years in advance. So I list here the key sort of milestones in the ORCAS proposal process. As I mentioned, in early 2013, we started thinking about this and circulating sort of white papers among the PIs. In January of 2014, we submitted what's called the Scientific Program Overview and Experimental Design Overview documents to what is the NSF Observing Facilities Assessment Panel. The SPO is essentially an NSF proposal. It follows the same format and it goes out for review, but there's no budget associated with it. In May, the OFAP met and they essentially comment on the feasibility of the project, and then NSF takes their comments and the reviews of the SPO and decides whether to encourage you to proceed to a full proposal. That happened in August, which was several months later than it usually happens, and then we got our proposal in October, as well as the formal facility request for the aircraft. And we learned in February that we would be funded. So that was actually less than a year from actually flying. So at that point, everybody flew into panic mode. Less than a month after getting our funding decision, we had 2 supplemental proposals submitted and a full science team meeting here in Boulder. We met again in August to go through simulated flight planning exercises and to test our models and our mission design concepts. Upload began in November, and then we were in Chile on January 14th for 6 weeks of flights. We conducted 19 research flights, a total of 98 hours. By all measures, the campaign was very successful. We were able to achieve all of our main objectives, and a lot of the big challenges we had anticipated didn't materialize in terms of airspace or aircraft maintenance. Everything worked great. The instruments all performed at a very high level for being that far away from home. So then in September, we had a science team meeting here in Boulder where we started diving in on the analyses, and the full data set is going to be available to the public here in about a month or two. So moving on to the objectives that came out of all of that planning, the large-scale objective was to measure the full distributions of CO2 and oxygen in the atmosphere, to characterize how much was coming out of the Southern Ocean over summer, how much oxygen was coming out and CO2 going in. On smaller scales, we targeted measuring ratios between oxygen and CO2 and gradients through the mid-troposphere. As well, on the regional scale, is relationships between oxygen and CO2 jumping across the boundary layer. And we did actually attempt some direct flux estimates using Lagrangian-style flights. Additionally, we had the hyperspectral remote sensor on with its own set of objectives. We had several instruments measuring a whole suite of biogenic gases, and we had the cloud microphysics component. This is a list of the payload. I won't go through every little detail here, but just to stress that measurements from aircraft are hard, and redundancy is a very important thing. So we had at least 2, sometimes 3 instruments measuring all of the key species. So we had an in situ analyzer measuring oxygen and CO2 that is called the Airborne. The NCAR Airborne Oxygen Instrument that I have developed and maintain uses a vacuum ultraviolet absorption technique to measure oxygen. We also collected 32 whole air samples per flask that went back to scripts for oxygen, CO2, and a number of other isotope ratios. We had a Harvard quantum cascade laser, a NOAA Picaro that are both measuring CO2 and methane, and then I've mentioned already the remote sensor. AWAS is another whole air sampler that was collecting 48 samples per flight for reactive gases. TOGA is a GC that makes in situ measurements of reactive gases, and then hopefully you can see at the bottom of my screen here. Oops, didn't like that, sorry. I tried to move my menu bar and I'll just get there. Okay, moving on to the modeling component. I mentioned we had a great team of modelers involved from very early on. One of the things Matt developed leading up to the campaign was a version of CESM that was doing forecasts. So this was the ocean biogeochemistry model that is part of the Community Earth System model that's being forced by an atmosphere that's nudged to GEOS 5, a GEOS 5 forecast product. So we had 3-day forecasts of air, sea, oxygen, and CO2 fluxes. The way ocean models work, the eddies and the blooms were not necessarily in the exactly right spot, but the wind was more or less correct. So things like plumes blowing around and fronts and areas with really high gas exchange because of a storm coming over were captured by the model. We also collaborated with the team that supports the Antarctic Mesoscale Prediction System, AMPS, and had a number of different resolution forecast products. This is a plot from the 9-kilometer grid of things like cloud cover and boundary layer heights and icing potential and a whole host of other things very critical for flight planning. And then the University of Michigan team was running the backwards particle dispersion model, also in forward mode to predict where the air masses were coming from and going to. And this supported the Lagrangian flux flights we did, and in sort of post-campaign mode, it's now supporting quantitative flux estimation by defining influence functions for every measurement that we collected. So the model that Matt put together, I mentioned, was doing 3-day forecast, and this proved to be invaluable in terms of developing intuition about the system. I'm just going to flip over and try to run an animation. Hopefully you can see this. If it's a little jerky, there's a link to a YouTube version of this in my slides that you can look up later. This I just started was in the fall when you might have seen the oxygen was going into the ocean. And by the time of the campaign, oxygen was coming out strongly. And one of the things, let me just pause it for a minute and say what you're looking at. On the left or lower left is the oxygen flux, coupled to the atmospheric component of the model, showing you what the distribution of oxygen is in the atmosphere. And then in the upper right is the same thing for CO2. So this was, let me see, I just paused it on Valentine's Day. CO2 was predicted to be going into the ocean for most of the Southern Ocean, and you can see the deficit in the atmosphere, and oxygen's coming out. One of the things that we realized from staring at these model simulations was how filamentary the atmospheric signals were. I think I may have misstated as to what this actually is. This is the surface concentration of oxygen and CO2 in the lowest atmospheric layer of the model. I think I accidentally said it was the flux. So what you see here to the southeast of Chile is a narrow plume of atmospheric oxygen that has been produced from a region where probably the winds blew hard over a highly productive region, and then that filament of high oxygen sort of moves its way downwind. We also had the fluxes themselves that were being forecast to look at. So I'm just going to jump back to the presentation and show you one particular day and a case study of a flight that we did. This is January 21st, a day when the model was predicting a really high plume of oxygen over the Bellingshausen Sea, which you can see there to the west of the Antarctic Peninsula, and a deficit in CO2 that's more concentrated along the marginal ice zone. Both of these, of course, are being predicted by the model because of net productivity, photosynthetic production of oxygen, and consumption of CO2, and dwarfing any sort of thermal forcing that might have been going on at this time. So what this actually looks like when we went to fly it, I'll flip back to another animation, is shown here. And so we have a forward-looking camera on the plane, and it's taking off from Punta Arenas, and the camera freezes up as it goes through some supercooled liquid water, and then you slowly see this lens of ice sublimate away. On the lower right is plotted oxygen and CO2, oxygen in red and CO2 in blue. And we're cruising along right now in the stratosphere. There was one altitude is shown in gray, so we did a dip back down into the tropopause, saw some variations. And in a few seconds here, which is actually probably 30 minutes on the plane, we're going to do a profile down into the boundary layer, and as the plane goes into the boundary layer, you'll see oxygen spikes up and CO2 spikes down, and that's essentially that signal that was predicted by the model. We then turned, we're right in sort of the marginal ice zone here, as you can see by the icebergs flying around, and did a series of shallow porpoises between 5,000 feet and 500 feet as we headed north. And if you look at the traces in the lower right, you can see that essentially each time the plane dipped down into the boundary layer, oxygen went up and CO2 went down, but the signals were not perfectly correlated. The lowest CO2 concentrations were right when we did our southernmost dip, and if I let this play through, you'll see that the elevated oxygen concentrations persisted further to the north. I'll just let this go for a little while longer and say a few things about the various objectives on a given flight. We typically tried to do some intensive boundary layer sampling, but then also capture the large-scale latitudinal, altitudinal distribution of oxygen. So what you'll see here is we're now going to start doing profiles all the way up to the upper troposphere and back down. And then we tried to hit targets of opportunity for the PRISM remote sensing instrument. The Southern Ocean, as you probably know, is extremely cloudy, something like 85% cloud cover at this time of year. So we had to sort of find places where there weren't clouds and that the aircraft could see. This particular flight went and buzzed the Southern Ocean OOI node, and then turned around and flew a couple legs over an area that had open clouds before returning to Punta Arenas. So in the lower right, you start to get a sense for these larger scale gradients. I'll just jump to the end here so you can see the plane coming in to Punta Arenas. It went through a little bit of icing on the way back down. The team that's doing cloud mechaphysics loves that data, and here we are coming in to land in Punta Arenas. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Just to show a couple slides of the data themselves. This is what that particular flight looks like if you plot it in altitude, latitude space with oxygen on the left and CO2 on the right. As I mentioned, the plume of oxygen down low was very widespread latitudinally, with the most intense buildup of oxygen right over the marginal ice zone. And conversely for CO2, we had this big drawdown of CO2. Going into this project, we had members of the PI team who basically were predicting we weren't going to see anything for CO2. That the changes would be too small to actually measure, and they ended up being huge and quite a bit larger than you would predict from sort of climatological flux estimates. And of course, the anti-correlation with oxygen was not something that we necessarily knew we would see either. If you take all of the measurements from all of the flights and put them, this is just a quick Google Earth snapshot of everywhere we flew on the right. If you can kind of turn your head, you can see there were 19 flights. A number of the flights actually were to fly to the north to get out of Punta Arenas when high winds were forecast. These high winds, there was not a hangar there, and the high winds could have damaged the Gulfstream 5 sitting there on the tarmac. So when the winds got over about 35 miles per hour or were forecast to, the plane would leave, and that happened 4 different times during the campaign. Unfortunately, it turned out we didn't anticipate this, but the times when the Antarctic Peninsula was cloud-free happened to be basically a day after a strong wind event would come through Drake Passage. So a couple of the best remote sensing opportunities we had to miss because the plane had to go up to Port Oumont to avoid the high winds. If you take all the flights and you bin them by latitude and altitude, as I'm doing here, 1,000 meters altitude and 5 degrees latitude, you can plot oxygen versus CO2, and these are colored by altitude, so the red points are the lower altitude points. You get a really tight correlation. And this was somewhat surprising to see. We know from flying around that you can get lots of different ratios for an individual boundary layer signal, but when you lump them all together and average them up, you get this really tight anti-correlation, and this of course is showing that biology is the dominant driver of fluxes at this time of year. We can compare that. We can also compare these binned observations to the model. If you look first on the right, you can see that the correlation between the model on the y-axis and the observations on the x-axis for CO2 was remarkable. This of course makes Matt and people working with that CSM model very happy. However, the model was overestimating the oxygen gradients by almost 50%. So that indicates that it was not necessarily getting the CO2 gradients right for the right reason. So that's one of the things we're diving into now. A few other just examples. Here's a estimate of chlorophyll A from the PRISM hyperspectral remote sensor as we flew past Palmer Station. This plot is oriented sort of 90 degrees from what you'd expect. North is off to the right. The pink dot is Palmer. And you can see a lot of the high spatial structure here. Every single pixel that PRISM measures has a full spectrum, something like 600 or 700 wavelengths. So this is just one sort of two-dimensional representation of what's sort of a three-dimensional data set. On the right are a couple examples of reactive gas measurements, bromoform, both plotted versus oxygen. Bromoform in the top right is biogenic marine gas produced in the marine boundary layer and involved in atmospheric chemistry as a halocarbon. And we saw very nice correlations between oxygen and bromoform throughout the campaign. Acetonitrile is an industrial solvent produced in the northern hemisphere that has ocean sinks, and we saw a really tight anti-correlation between acetonitrile and oxygen. And our reactive gas team is excited about these measurements and working on the data and scientific analyses. To wrap up, the campaign was very successful. As I mentioned, we got all of our primary objectives and a number of things that we didn't really expect to see that we're quite excited about. We measured the total amount of CO2 and oxygen over the Southern Ocean very well with these flights, and those are providing estimates of large scale, full Southern Ocean seasonal net outgassing of oxygen and net ingassing of CO2. The correlations, the ratios between oxygen and CO2 tell us something about what's actually driving the CO2 fluxes, and you can go back to that first plot from Anav and sort of rule out the half of the models that think that CO2 is coming out of the Southern Ocean during January and February could probably be rejected, at least in terms of 2016. It was quite clear that there were really strong CO2 uptake fluxes happening. So I mentioned CESM did a really good job on CO2, but overestimated the oxygen signals. I didn't show this, but the signals evolved over the 6-week campaign, consistent with the strength of the fluxes tapering off for both CO2 and oxygen. There are reactive gas, remote sensing, and cloud microphysics results as well. There's a whole host of other intensive observations, biogeochemically relevant observations going on in the Southern Ocean now, including SOCOM and the Palmer Antarctic LTR and the OOI nodes, and other measurements going on the Gould and Palmer, and we're trying to leverage those as much as we can. And a final point that measuring oxygen from aircraft is fairly new, and doing these types of measurements over the ocean to get at air, sea, CO2, and oxygen fluxes is also new, but we think that the methods and approaches we've developed can be applied at other times of year and in other regions. For example, you could go back during the spring bloom and you'd see much stronger oxygen and CO2 fluxes, much greater signals, and would be able to address other science questions. There are other places in the Northern Hemisphere, and in particular coastal regions, which might be amenable to this type of study. I will stop there and thank you for your attention, and look forward to taking questions.